Hello, and welcome to our third stop in our series on the neuropsychological effects of substance use. My name is Brad Reynolds, and today we're going to be covering cocaine. Cocaine, like marijuana, remains very prevalent in the developed world, and particularly in the United States. In the late 70s, 80s, and even into the 90s, cocaine saw a major uptick in use and popularization through the media. A lot of businessmen are seen in movies and television shows getting ahead late at night, doing lines of cocaine. You have, military officials doing cocaine to stay up late, work through, horribly grueling shifts. And cocaine for us is one of those things where it's a substance that we don't really well understand. I mean, we know it to be one of those things where the individuals that take it, at least how it's captured in movies and in television, is just very manic, very up and joyful and euphoric. And in reality, cocaine can have a really mixed bag of effects. And it's also problematically very addictive because of that sort of rush of energy, that influx of sort of gratification and reward response that we get from inhaling it. And because we're inhaling it, which is by far the most common modality of consumption, it hits much quicker. And so you get that sort of immediate high and release, which makes it much more tricky to manage in terms of weaning off and ultimately remaining abstinent from cocaine. So, one of the things I wanted to talk about right off the bat is sort of the differences in dose. So again, these are sort of guesstimates, and it's going to depend a lot on just different contextual factors, but a low dose amount, which is about one line, a typical line based on the research, you actually see enhanced executive functioning, and that's mainly through increased processing speed, motor activity, and vigilance. But the problem is with cocaine is there's a very, very fine line. And after maybe the smallest of bumps of cocaine, what you get is somebody who's much more vigilant, but their accuracy in terms of attention, their ability to shift quickly and efficiently, it gets compromised because even though they're much more vigilant for what's going on around them, they tend to make more errors in that attention. They tend to over-attend to things that are irrelevant. And so it actually impacts our ability to do things smoothly, efficiently. And so just a little bit more than that small amount, and the stimulant becomes almost like this complete disinhibition, this complete sort of manic hyperactivity, which does impact cognitive function negatively. So again, for folks that say, oh yeah, like some cocaine will really get me to focus now, well, you're definitely going to be much more vigilant. But in terms of accurately attending to your environment and focusing on the targets or things you need to be doing, the research would suggest you're going to have much more difficulty regulating that attention. So just something to keep in mind in terms of how we understand cocaine and its cognitive. Now, the biological mechanisms are pretty similar to what we saw with marijuana and also with alcohol. There's a huge impact on dopamine and glutamate, and particularly within those prefrontal, limbic, and striatal systems that were introduced in the first video of our series. And if you're just stopping by now, I would encourage you to go back to the first video because it's going to review these areas in depth in terms of the prefrontal structures, the limbic elements that are contributing here, as well as the neighboring striatal, and of course, even down into the upper brainstem and cerebellum that impact decision-making, impulsivity, reward response, and motor activity to and from reward. So just things to keep in mind going forward. So there's increased prefrontal activation, and because of that, it seems like it hijacks our limbic emotional kind of those core emotional structures get overrun. And so we're much more seeking of reward under the influence of this influx of dopamine and glutamate. And again, what it gives us, because that prefrontal cortex is activated, is we're much more vigilant, but we lose control. So the prefrontal cortex is very much important in regulating attentional control. It gives us what we call working memory. So our ability to acquire new information, manipulate that information internally, and sort of interact with it appropriately in an efficient manner. That cognitive control, that sort of working memory piece, our efficiency and accuracy of that is lost as a product of us being hyper-vigilant and attentive to basically everything in the environment. So again, sensitivity improves, but cognitive flexibility is reduced. And memory, of course, because we're hyper attentive to everything, our ability to encode new information also gets compromised because too much gets into that working memory circuit, and we're not able to sort of acquire and effectively package that information for later recall. So new learning of information actually does get eroded by too much stimulant introduction, and particularly with cocaine, that is the case. The long-term consequences, which we'll talk about a little bit later, is the fact that it's very, very addictive. Cocaine is one of the most tricky, along with methamphetamine and heroin, and a lot of it has to do with that immediate rush of positive euphoria, hyperactivation of those prefrontal systems. You feel attentive, alive, engaged, energized. That's a very positive mind state for most human beings. And so it becomes a very gratifying and rewarding mental state. And so to try to discontinue cocaine is exceptionally challenging, and a lot of it does have to do with the mechanisms in terms of how quickly it impacts us. So there's a higher risk of relapse, and a lot of folks seem to not adhere. It actually has one of the most frustrating treatment outcome research in terms of folks tend to drop out. There's a lot of difficulty maintaining abstinence with cocaine for those that are chronic. So what are the neurologic effects? Well, what tends to happen is that to compensate for this influx of dopamine and glutamate, monoamine receptors, and in general, the neurotransmitters themselves tend to decrease over time. So this is among regular users. And the DA2 receptor and the glutamate receptor availability in these areas, predominantly in that PFC, the prefrontal cortex, limbic, and striatal structures, to compensate for this influx, the brain is thinking, well, we've got enough of it out there, so we don't need receptors out there to try to catch any more of this and create more of the effects that we'd expect from the neurotransmitter. So the receptors end up downregulating, is what we call it, and pulling back into the cell body and being recycled for other materials within the cell because there's so much dopamine going in from this repeated cocaine use. So the brain ends up adapting, and that has negative consequences. This impacts connectivity between these regions. It creates inefficiency. There's also thought to be some changes to gene transcription related to processing of dopamine and glutamate, as well as reduced cellular expansion in the hippocampus. Now, for this last piece, I know it has to do with the limbic system itself in terms of the different bidirectional feeds between the hippocampus and the limbic system, but why there's changes to the actual cell structures in the hippocampus, I'm not 100% sure. So that was reviewed in a study, and I know that's why I put it in here, but I'm going to have to get back to you guys on exactly what is the sort of metabolic and neurotransmitter mechanisms impacting that reduction of cellular flexibility and expansion in the hippocampus. So what we tend to see then, in terms of more global changes, is diffuse gray matter changes. So remember, that's predominantly cell bodies that we're looking at. Those tend to be reduced, whereas you've got the myelinated parts of neurons, right? Largely the axons, the white matter that runs across each hemisphere. Those superhighways also get degraded, particularly in the frontal areas, in the adjacent and right behind it, the anterior cingulate cortex and the temporal lobe. And there's actually some reduced volume, or what we call atrophy, of the brain in chronic users. Again, it's somewhat mild and inconsistent, but the prefrontal cortex is exceptionally vulnerable. And there's also abnormal activation, so electrophysiological changes within the brain. In all of those areas there, the putamen being part of the the globus pallidus, part of the basal ganglia, the cerebellum, and the parietal regions, all of these again have to do with how we interface with both sensory information as well as how do we plan and enact motor responses towards reward and response. And the dorsolateral prefrontal also being involved in motor control, and of course, how we evaluate and interact with reward response information. And I also want to caveat too with the orbital frontal, which we haven't really pointed out yet. If you remember from the first, if you did watch it from the first video, the orbital frontal cortex is paramount for processing of reward response and social behavioral contingencies within different environments. So it really regulates how we control our emotions and our behavior when looking at context, and especially in social settings in which drug use is very much implicated. So what are the neuropsychological effects, right? I mean, I'm working to sort of give you guys a good profile. And, again, a lot of these studies, there's just variability. And again, a lot of it has to do with the fact that cocaine users rarely use only cocaine. There's always sometimes, I say always sometimes, there is sometimes concurrent use of alcohol, tobacco, marijuana, other illicit substances. And it complicates our ability to study human models interacting with only cocaine. That being said, the profile tends to much more look like a subcortical frontal profile. And what I mean by that is that it's looking at domains that are predominantly involving those prefrontal cortices and then the structures that share a lot of those bidirectional relationships with the frontal lobes. So again, the limbic system, the basal ganglia, the upper brainstem, the cerebellum. These are areas that very much are involved in enacting higher order cognitive faculties. So what is, the most often deficits reported tend to involve the executive function domain. And again, like I mentioned in that first video, it's a very nebulous construct. Executive function really does encompass quite a few sort of human, I don't want to default to higher order. It's sort of necessary faculties to be an effective human being in an evolving and complex environment. So again, things like being flexible, adaptable, malleable, setting goals and being able to monitor your progress towards those goals, problem solving when information and situational context changes. And of course, decision making. How do we evaluate our prior behavior and our prospective consequences and make effective decisions? These all fall under executive function. But what happens is in the literature is you group a lot of the more subservient domains like attention, working memory, processing speed. These things are subsumed by executive function because they're sort of the baseline skills you need to be able to then consider whether or not somebody has intact executive functioning, right? So somebody can't really be mentally flexible if processing speed is very, very poor, right? Or somebody, you can't look at problem solving if working memory and basic attention are compromised because their ability to look at consequences and adapt on the fly is going to be impacted by disruption of those lower domains. So that whole aside to say, those are the things that are impacted most by cocaine. And set shifting in particular, I want to highlight, and it really speaks to the inaccuracy of attention and attention control with chronic cocaine use. So again, in set switching, the idea is that you're sort of interacting with two different bits of information. It's another way of saying is almost like multitasking. So one of the common tests we give is we have folks alternate either orally or through visual motor in terms of sketching or tracing out, switching between numbers in a series and letters. And so you have to go from something like 1A, 2B, 3C. And the idea is that you have to sort of keep both sets online in your brain and working memory. And at the same time, with your sort of frontal domains controlling it, is alternate between those sets efficiently and effectively without making errors or failing to switch between the sets. So set shifting is really poor in cocaine use is what they found because our ability to modulate attention is compromised. And again, it's not that we can't register the information. We can quickly appreciate everything that we're hearing and everything that we're seeing, but because it's so much of an information overload, attention control tends to go down because we're overly vigilant for that information. And so the fluidity and efficiency of switching is not great. Memory is also impacted. And last one, when we were talking about marijuana, I talked at length about the different memory domains. What it tends to be is that auditory verbal is more sensitive, and it's probably because there's, again, auditory verbal attention is impacted quite a bit in cocaine use. But the profile, to give it more specifics, tends to look, again, more of like issues with initial encoding of information or getting it into the correct folder for storage and pulling out the correct folder from the filing cabinet 15 to 20 minutes later. So retrieval errors are common. Information gets poorly organized, and they need a lot of cueing and prompting to get out the right information. And it's much more prominent, again, in the verbal modality versus the visual modality. And I'm basing this on a Verdeo-Garcia paper where it provided a nice meta-analysis, I believe, of a lot of this information. So this isn't me just nitpicking studies. This is looking more at like global findings across the research. And then emotional processing is also impacted. And the reason for this too is probably because of the fact that the limbic system is involved and the cingulate cortex being sort of very much focal in processing of emotional information and sort of conducting appropriate emotional response. It doesn't surprise me that given chronic cocaine use might impact dopamine and glutamate function in those areas, that emotion also might be dysregulated. I mean, folks tend to become more agitated, more irritable. And again, what it's showing here is they actually have a problematic or dysfunctional response to negative emotions, particularly fear and anger, which are very strong negative emotions. Language tends to be preserved, which is encouraging, though I would argue that probably fluidity of word finding or accuracy in word finding might be impacted due to chronic disruption to executive function. Visual spatial abilities like construction, processing tends to be okay. And then motor functioning, surprisingly, in chronic users, at least globally, tends to be okay. There might be some more motor errors, maybe some impulsivity in terms of enacting a motor response, but motorically, they don't look completely dysfunctional. And to draw an aside to that or a comparison, remember in alcohol use, psychomotor activity tends to be one of the most long-standing deficits in chronic users as well as in those that have achieved abstinence. Some of that research out of Stanford showed that. And in terms of recreational users, so this is infrequent use. They tend to have some problems with learning, particularly in the verbal domain. Retrieval, so that's assessed through recognition accuracy. They just need a little bit more assistance getting out the correct information from the filing cabinet. And it's unclear whether or not infrequent use, based on the extant research, results in more persistent deficits. So the final part of this section is really the functional recovery. So one of the things is that working memory and the inhibition set shifting piece that I've spoken to you on length on, that piece of recovery, it seems like it does improve with abstinence. And there was a study specifically by Potvin in 2014 in which after about 5 months of abstinence, there was minimal difference with controls for many of these domains. Now, the one thing that we're still trying to tease out, and I realize I now have double number 2 there, just a pet peeve for us PowerPoint users, is that there's unknown duration for many of the neurophysiological and pathological changes I talked about a couple slides prior. So again, there is definitely some issue with, whether or not the metabolic changes, the downregulation of dopamine and glutamate, whether or not those changes will persist with abstinence. It hasn't been well studied in terms of that from a neuroimaging and sort of lab piece in terms of looking at the physiometrics. And the complications is because cocaine users have poor attention control and emotion regulation, they seem to have not only a stronger bias towards drug-related cues, which obviously is linked to relapse, but again, the potency of the substance in terms of how it affects the human brain and that reward being so acute, it becomes very much a very strong contingency for use. And so abstinence is difficult for these folks, and especially since the executive function deficits may linger at least for a couple months. If you can't escape that, getting back to baseline with sustained abstinence for weeks to months, there's a very high risk related to those executive function deficits for failure to maintain abstinence. So something to keep in mind. The next section we'll go on soon enough will be methamphetamine. Again, I really wanted to highlight this one just because it's very much prevalent in the Midwest. Again, in my time at the University of Tulsa, methamphetamine is the drug of choice out there, along with alcohol use and tobacco. And methamphetamine has some very unique neurophysiological, pathological effects. And also the cognitive profile is just very difficult to understand because it's such a broad range of impact. And again, meth is one of those things where it's a very potent substance with, again, very robust effects. And that euphoria that people get, it's very alluring. It makes for a very powerful contingency for use and makes it very hard to break. So anyways, we'll step on that on next time. Again, I appreciate everybody's feedback. I'm really grateful if you stop by the page or anything like that, again, this is really just a passion project for me. I very much enjoy talking about substance use and really finding ways for us to better map it out from a psychological and cognitive perspective and help educate the community, again, on just the myths about what certain substances do to the body, but also how there can be really a lot of potential for lingering consequences, and helping understand also as well the risk of relapse and why, from a cognitive and psych piece, why it's there to begin with. So again, thank you for your time. My name is Brad Reynolds. And again, thank you for checking out this series. We'll talk soon. Everybody stay safe out there, stay healthy. And yeah, we're in this together. Let's do it.